Sadar. I am the program manager here at Historic New England. And if you're not familiar with Historic New England, we are the largest, oldest regional historic preservation organization in the country. And we are delighted tonight to have Keith Stokes with us to talk about God's Little Acre, which is a historic burial ground for the African heritage community in Newport, Rhode Island. He's going to talk to us about what the burial ground can tell us about the community it served, as well as a little bit about the history and restoration of the burial ground itself. Just a little bit about Keith. He is currently vice president with the 1696 Heritage Group, which is a historical consulting firm dedicated to helping persons and institutions of color to increase their knowledge and access to the light of the truth of their unique American heritage. Mr. Stokes has a long and distinguished career in business and community development and has been advisor for Rhode Island with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and along with other numerous historic and cultural organizations. So thank you so much, Mr. Stokes, for joining us tonight. We're going to get your screen up. Thank you. Just a couple of more housekeeping items before we get started. If you want to ask a question, we are going to be taking questions at the end of the program. So please put them in the Q&A function, which you should see in your menu bar and not in the chat. It just makes it a little bit easier for us to handle questions at the end. And we all are also recording this program, so everyone who has signed up will receive a copy of the recording in the follow-up email I will send tomorrow. As well as Mr. Stokes' contact information. So if you have additional questions or want to get in touch with him, you'll be able to through that follow-up email. So I am delighted to introduce Keith Stokes, who will be talking about the God's Little Acre burial ground in Newport, Rhode Island. Keith?
Claire, thank you, and thank you, Historic New England, for this opportunity. I'm going to attempt to provide about 4 centuries of history in about 40 minutes. So a bit of a challenge, but again, I'm very willing and able and interested in answering any questions that you might have after the presentation. The presentation will be divided into 4 parts. Part 1 is the early origins of Africa before European colonization. Part 2 will be the advent of slavery, generally in New England, but particularly from a Newport, Rhode Island perspective. Part 3 will talk about the evolution of the African heritage community in Newport and later the free community. And then part 4 will be the burial ground that they are very much a part of. And then the final part will be a short musical interlude to kind of introduce you to some of the most important markers within the burying ground. The title that we selected are Stories in Stone. We call it America's Colonial African Burying Ground because today it is, if not it is certainly one of the oldest and largest existing enslaved and free African burying grounds in America. Today we have close to 300 surviving markers, with many more still to be recovered. So let me begin this presentation with a very important beginning on the history of Africans in America. And that beginning is not slavery. In fact, slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our African ancestors survived and thrived despite enslavement. So the starting point of this history has to start in the continent of Africa. And what we now know, and what is important to convey, is the fact that well before European colonization or settlement, Africa as a continent in its many countries, and we'll be focusing on the West African connection to the Americas, was very well established with civilizations, with technologies, trade routes, and most importantly, with religious and cultural orientations. And in the case of West Africa, that's mostly closely aligned with New England and Rhode Island, we know that well before European colonization, there were well entrenched a number of very notable kingdoms, including the Ghana Empire, the Nuri Kingdom, Yoruba, which is today northern Nigeria, were all in place, and many of them were actively involved in trade in a number of economies, including rice, salt, silver, gold. What's most important is that in understanding this, those Africans that were enslaved and brought to the West Indies and South America, in some cases to the Americas, brought not only their labor, they brought with them their culture, their language, their religion, their foodstuffs, and most importantly, their ability as forced immigrants to continue that African identity despite enslavement. So the story here is not a story of slavery. It's a story of African heritage people who were able to thrive and survive despite slavery in one of the most important leave behind touchstones, the African burial ground in Newport. But it is important to recognize the slave trade was a significant program that would move men, women, children, products from old world to new world. And in the case of Newport's tie, we have a number of primary, secondary sources that begins to unveil this connection across what is called the triangular trade or the transatlantic trade. That trade is basically summarized in this image of the very famous 1752 Sanderson voyage, where a vessel leaves Newport. It is bringing with it largely hogshead barrels of rum, which is used as the trading commodity for enslaved Africans along, at the time called the Gold Coast, today recognized as Ghana. And there, that rum was traded for enslaved African men, women, and children, who were then transported across the Middle Passage to the West Indies. In New England generally, the 17th century, Barbados is a major trading partner in the triangular trade with the Boston, Providence, Newport, and New London, Connecticut. Later in the 18th century, it would be Jamaica. And then those Africans would be very much the large part of the labor force working in coffee, tobacco, and particularly sugar plantations. The raw materials from sugar plantations, such as sugar and molasses, are transported back, in this case, to Newport, but it could have been Boston, it could have been New London, it could have been Bristol, Rhode Island. And there, those raw materials would be distilled into rum. So the triangular trade, or the African trade, in New England's case, is very much tied to the rum trade. And one of the things that we've been able to do in Rhode Island, particularly here in Newport, is to be able to review primary and secondary documents and reconstruct as many of the documented slave voyages that we can identify. So as of today, we recognize between 1705 and 1807, there are at least 934 Rhode Island-sponsored slave voyages between West Africa to the West Indies and back to Rhode Island. Out of that 934, 72% are my hometown of Newport, 672 ships. Newport is one of the most active and one of the most efficient and one of the most effective slave trading towns as a part of the most effective slave trading colony of Rhode Island during the colonial era. Also, as I said before, and it's important to recognize, is that these Africans that arrived here were more than chattel property. They were what we call today forced immigrants. When we think of an immigrant, we think of them arriving with their language, their religion, their culture, and their labor. Well, we also have to think and recognize that these Africans were very similar. They brought so much more to them, despite the challenges of being chattel property, that would contribute directly to the economic, social, religious, and cultural settlement of early New England. And one of the most important things that I've been able to do is to have the privilege and opportunity to actually work with the National Trust from Curacao, Barbados, Bahama, Jamaica, and actually have an ability to review records of New England, and particularly Rhode Island and Newport slave trading and transportation activity, from ship logs to captain's accounts to diaries, to be able to reconstruct not only the transatlantic trade, but more importantly, the movement through the African diaspora of African men, women, and children. What we now know is that Newport particularly, but generally in Rhode Island, most of the Rhode Island vessels would land in what was called the Gold Coast, but today recognized as Ghana, would land at one of a number of slave castles along that coast. The two most prominent slave castles where we have primary and secondary record documentation is the Cape Coast Castle, and most importantly, Fort William at Ananabo. I had the chance to be invited to travel to Fort William and to actually experience interacting at the castle at Ananabo, where my own ancestor was taken from and transported via the Middle Passage to the West Indies at Jamaica, and then eventually to Philadelphia and Newport. What's important about Ananabo is the fact that that is by far the leading slave trading connection to New England generally, and particularly Rhode Island. Many of the Africans would eventually arrive and survive the transatlantic trade and arrive in New England and Rhode Island, originated via Cape Coast Castle and Ananabo. Many of them themselves were of the Akan people, made up of largely the Ashanti and Fanti tribes. Now, one of the most important indicators of recognizing that is a very important Akan tradition that exists at the time, that exists to this very day. Children born, boys and girls, into the Akan people were given a day name, or a name based on a birth order. In fact, my own ancestor's name was Otaba, which means to stay put, and later phonetically that was pronounced as October. Well, we find in the case of generally New England, but particularly in Rhode Island, thousands of instances of Africans that either maintained or reclaimed an African day name. So if you're a boy born on Friday, your day name is Kofi, K-O-F-I, or phonetically or anglicized to Cuffy or Cuff. Possibly one of the most famous and well-recognized Africans of colonial New England is Paul Cuffy, whose father was Cuffy Slocum and mother an indigenous woman. When Paul Cuffy became free, he dropped his slave name of Paul Slocum and took on his day name and became Paul Cuffy. One of the most important aspects of recognizing this tradition is that we've been able to go through primary and secondary records and reconstruct the names of thousands of African men, women, and children by their day name that once lived, worked, worshiped in colonial New England, but also in Barbados and across Jamaica. So these day naming traditions are one of a number of traditions that Africans were able to preserve to maintain some level of their African identity. And for someone of African descent that's a part of that history, it gives me a strong sense that these were real people with flesh and blood, more than chattel property, more than the enslaved. And it's the business of slavery that is not only Rhode Island, but is really centered in New England. It's always been interesting to me to travel across the diaspora, but particularly across the American South, and we still see American slavery is vested in the antebellum of the early 19th century American South, and there's very little recognition and knowledge and understanding of the interpretation of the very origins of slavery in the Americas is very much a New England condition. In this particular side, you have from the Rhode Island State Archives one of a series of letters sent by Governor Josiah Linden of Newport, who was sending letters to Great Britain, specifically to the Great Britain Board and Lord Commissioners of Trade and Plantations, highlighting the fact that the newly enacted Sugar Act of 1764 would have dire economic consequences, particularly to Rhode Island. And some of the highlights of the letter that he points out is the fact that in Rhode Island, we're just a teeny tiny colony, no more than about 30 miles in circumference. More importantly, we have really bad weather and bad soil. We are not producing the cash crops that are generating tax revenue and prosperity to Mother England and to the colonies. They're not growing rice, sugar, cotton, tobacco. That's not happening in New England. Bad soil, bad weather. We are almost completely dependent in our aftermarket products. We take raw materials that come from the plantation of the West Indies, and in our case, such as rum, we have become prosperous in rum production. In this sugar tax on the molasses and sugar transported from the West Indies, from the rum that's being traded and sold into the aftermarkets, will have a significant impact in our prosperity, our sole prosperity. In fact, at that time of that letter from Josiah Linden, there were over 30 rum distilleries operating in the colony of Rhode Island, 24 alone on the waterfront of Newport. Rhode Island was involved in close to 80% of the Guinea rum distilling and transport at that time. And in fact, as you see at the bottom of the slide, it is John Adams, our second president, in a letter well after the American Revolution, close to his death, that points out the fact that it's molasses that's the essential ingredient in American independence. And it is a true son of the liberty that writes what we call today a letter to the editor in the Newport Mercury newspaper in 1768, before the American Revolution, pointing out the irony that if you say you have the right to enslave Africans because it's your interest, why are you disputing the legality of Great Britain taxing you without representation? So there's a very clear irony of the fact that Rhode Island specifically, New England generally, is tied to the transatlantic slave, not only by slave trading and slave ownership, but by the products and goods that are directly derived from this economy. And again, another great irony is that Josiah Linden, the governor, he himself owned slaves. And in God's Little Acre, that you'll learn a little bit more in a few minutes, there is a young enslaved boy named Pompey Stevens who dies. And at the time of his death, a marker is created by his owner, recognizing him as owned property, but also as a beloved child. This child, at the time of his death, his father and mother, Caesar Linden and Phyllis Linden, had a diary and wrote in the diary a week before his death, that he was dying of the bloody flux and that he was a beloved son. And what's extraordinary for us to be able to not only restore this burying ground, we now have the ability through research and recovery to actually be able to recover written primary documents that connect markers with real people, existing structures where Africans lived, worked, and worshiped, both enslaved and free, creating a full cycle of interpretation that connects the historic site with the historic lives of men, women, and families. And what most excites us is we're one of the few places that can tell this comprehensive story of African heritage people. And I want to point out that one of the uniqueness of early African enslavement, African and indigenous enslavement in New England generally, but particularly we see in Rhode Island, is that because of that bad weather and bad soil, we don't have an agricultural-based economy. There's not cash crops that are driving our prosperity. It's maritime trades. In fact, many of the Africans that are enslaved are living and working in urban seaports such as Boston, New London. We see them in Providence, Bristol, and particularly Newport. By 1755, nearly 1/3 of the entire population are enslaved. That's one of the highest percentage of enslaved to population at the time in early America, outside of maybe Charleston, South Carolina. So as these Africans arrive, yes, there are those that are working in the farms and the fields, but the larger numbers are working in the urban seaport areas, and they're looking to be trained in trade skills. They're being trained in trade skills because that was the work demand in the colonial time. There's not a large number and requirement for laborers because that labor work, that general labor work, was less required. But you do need Africans to be trained in rope making, rum distilling, candle making. We have Africans in both Providence and Newport that are trained and listed as master chocolate grinders, and they're cocoa beans being transported from South America to Rhode Island and then being grinded into chocolate to be sold into the marketplace. We have Africans that are involved in stonemasons, snuff making, soap making, barrel making. And these trade skills require a significant amount of training, apprenticeship, and access to education. My own ancestor that arrived in 1795 is trained as a Windsor chair maker and then later a cabinet maker. What's important about this is that for Africans generally in New England, but particularly in Rhode Island, having access to education, training, and apprentice skills are lifelong career path opportunities that would have been unheard of and unnecessary for an enslaved African who might have landed, unfortunately, in a rice plantation in the Carolinas, or a sugar plantation or a coffee plantation in the West Indies. So it's important to recognize that these Africans arriving were given access to training and education. They're involved in nearly every aspect of building and supporting the maritime economies of early Newport or Boston or Providence. And it gives them an opportunity through this training and education to organize themselves much earlier and much more effectively than Africans who were unfortunately enslaved further south in the Americas or the West Indies or South America. And in fact, one of the most important aspects of this access of training and education and language would propel these Africans in what we now call the first emancipation. Most people today, when they think of emancipation and the end of slavery in America, they begin to think of the end of the American Civil War in 1865. But in fact, the first major emancipation begins with the American independence. And between the late 18th century, by the end of the 18th century, nearly every New England and several northern colonies and now new states would abolish slavery. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans would now be free by the end of the 18th century with access to language, skills, training, and many had converted into religion or their master and mistress. This would have been unheard of and unnecessary and unlawful for those enslaved Africans who would have to wait to the emancipation of the Great Britain by 1834 or the emancipation of the United States of America by 1865. But it's this first emancipation that would set the stage for not only the eventual extinction of slavery in the Americas, but it would also create a new type of population in New England and in Newport, free Africans in America. And these free Africans began to organize. And we know this because the primary records that we have as a part of the collections of the Newport Historical Society, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, on November 10th, 1780, for the first time in world history, Africans that are free come together and they form a free African Union Society. The original minutes, prayer books, diaries, and other correspondence still exist between the 18th century and the early 19th century that begins to talk about these men who are nearly all tradesmen and literate in organizing this society. This society was organized for three basic purposes. One, they were census takers. They took every piece of demographic information they could find on enslaved and free Africans in Newport. Birth, death, marriage, children, schools, anything that they could find, trade skills, language, they took and put in place. Secondly, they absolutely believed that education was important, but from an African perspective. And in both Newport and Boston, almost simultaneously, they formed free African schools. Free meaning African-owned, African-operated, African-taught. Newport Africans felt so strongly about this society, they would reach out to fellow Africans across New England into Philadelphia, and over the next several years, free African Union societies were established in Newport, Philadelphia, Boston, and Providence. And again, we know this because each of these communities and their historical institutions have documents and collections where Africans are talking among themselves. The Africans in Newport are reaching out to a man named Prince Hall in Boston about, as he establishes a Masonic institution and how they can work together to support each other. Africans in Newport and Boston reach out to their counterparts in Philadelphia, and in Philadelphia, they're talking to two very important men, a Reverend Richard Allen, who would go on to form the first African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Bethel, and a Reverend Absalom Jones, who would form the first African Episcopal Church at St. Thomas. These men are interacting among themselves, and they're talking about what will life be for free Africans in America. In fact, every single one of these African Union societies would eventually evolve into free African churches. Some of the earliest free African churches in America had their starts with free Africans and their societies and building their identity right here in New England, and one that we're very proud about in Newport because the African Society in Newport would evolve later into the Union Colored Congregational Church. That building still stands. My family was a part of that congregation, and we have artifacts and heirlooms that date back to the 18th century. So what's important about this history is that Africans arrive as chattel property, but they take advantage of the opportunities of the economy and the market at that time and build trade skills and education. And then they immediately, with freedom, begin rebuilding African institutions and identities. And again, I just want to emphasize, they saw themselves not as Negro, not as colored, not as biracial, they were Africans. And they called their first institutions African Church, African societies, African schools. They were Africans in America. So I hope this first 15 minutes sets the stage of who these Africans were, how they arrived, and more importantly, how it would set the stage for them to ensure that they would have institutions in Newport that would meet the needs of free Africans, their own place of worship, their own school, and most importantly, because death is something that comes to all of us, a special place, a place where they could have proper burials. Today, Newport is a part of our common burying ground. The common burying ground was deeded to the town of Newport as early as 1650 by early settlement founder John Clark. John Clark, along with Roger Williams, are the two men with Ann Hutchinson who really are recognized as the first settlers and founders of Rhode Island, who bring forth what we call our lively experiment of separation church and state. It is John Clark that physically travels to England and brings back the July 2nd, 1663 Charter of Rhode Island that embodies that religious freedom. It is John Clark who so passionately believed in separation of church and state, he required that he would deed land in the northern part of town for a common burying ground, but his requirement was anyone, regardless of class or religious affiliation or race, has a right to be buried here. Newport has one of the oldest and earliest common burying grounds that today has close to 5,000 markers dating back to the mid-17th century and carrying forward to almost the present day. But it's by at least 1705, a section, a 1.5 acre section, is being dedicated for common people, but also we see enslaved Africans, or as we were called at the time, Negroes, and then later free Africans. By the middle of the 19th century, that area is being called by the free African American community God's Little Acre. What's most important is today, this burying ground, as I've said before, is one of the oldest and largest existing African enslaved and free burying grounds in America. And most importantly, working with historical institutions and scholars, we're able to speak so much more beyond the markers themselves. Who lived, who worked, who worshiped, and what family members are a part of this very important burying ground. And what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through some of the markers that are there. There are so many that we've been recovering and restoring. And one of the most exciting things for me as someone who's grown up in this burying ground, whose own family is a part of this, is I have to recognize the city of Newport, the city's Heritage Commission and Burying Ground Commission, the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and the Newport Historical Society, and the Preservation Society in Newport County. All of these institutions have come together in recognizing to not only restore this burying ground, but to maintain it and interpret it. It has been a team effort. If each and every community across America could show this level of interest in shared African-American history, we would all be so much better off. So everything that I speak to, the images that you see, are clearly a recognition of the team and the work of public and private bodies who've been stewards of this important place. So I want to walk you through some of the highlights of the markers, some of the most interesting markers that people have seen and have written about. One of the important things that is recognized there is the fact that well before freedom, as early as the 1740s, Africans are coming together in the spring, not only in Newport, but in Hartford, New London, New Hampshire. We see them in Massachusetts. We even see them in some aspects of the West Indies, but particularly in New England, they're coming together in June and they're organizing and they're selecting a tribal leader. The white community interpreted that as a mimicking of European and colonial elections. So they would call it the African governor or the Negro election day. But now, working with scholars in the West Indies and West Africa, they're telling us, no, this is a very sacred ritual of selecting a tribal leader that is done by the Ashanti people each year in many tribes, and it's being carried on and maintained in New England. In the case of Rhode Island, we have dozens of Africans that are selected as tribal leaders or African governors. We have a number in our burying ground, as does Connecticut, and as does in other parts of New England. This is possibly one of the first and certainly the most documented case of African organization, political, social, religious organization in early America. And again, it's not happening in Charleston, South Carolina or Richmond, Virginia. It's happening right here in New England. And in our case, we have a man named Pompey Brenton, who is one of a number of the African governors or tribal leaders of Newport. And his marker is one of the most, I would have to say, most exciting markers from the standpoint that it has been reshared and utilized by a number of historians and images across the country and even the world because of the very uniqueness of this marker. If you look very carefully at it, what we call the soul effigy or the angel or the death head, which represents the life in Christ and Christianity and the light and return of everlasting life after death, the angel in this case has very African features. We have a number of examples where these soul effigies have African features. You will not find, first of all, you very rarely find surviving markers of enslaved and free Africans much anywhere because they're lost through vandalism, urban redevelopment. But in Newport's case, much of it is maintained, much of it has been restored, but most importantly, this image gives you a strong sense that this Pompey Brenton, who once lived, worked, worshiped, and eventually died by 1772 in Colonial Newport, didn't look like George or Martha Washington. He looked like a person of African descent. So this gives you a very primary source, tactile sense that people of African descent also lived and died in early Newport and early America. It's also important to recognize that the Africans in Newport, as they set up their society, would set up a burial society with very specific rules. In fact, we have a number of primary diaries and documents and cases of hundreds of Africans gathering in the center of town and marching out to the burying ground to bury a fellow African. In this case here, you have Reverend Ezra Stiles of Newport's Second Congregational Church. Reverend Stiles is today probably more recognized as a president of Yale University during the colonial era. But before the American Revolution, he's a Renaissance man. He is someone who's actively engaged in the conversions of Africans. He himself converts hundreds of Africans into a Second Congregational Church. It's all a part of the larger Great Awakening movement that's sweeping across Protestant colonial America at the time. And his diary, which still exists intact, you can find it online. He talks in details about not only converting Africans, but being mesmerized by these African funerals. And in this case here, he talks about an African funeral where a procession of 200 men and 130 women are going to the funeral of Quash Dunbar. And Quash Dunbar dies at age of 70. He dies May 18th, 1770. And this is a May 20th, 2 days later, written in the Diary of Ezra Stiles as he talks about this ritual, which he had never quite seen before, and it's much larger and grander than any Quaker, Baptist, or other Christian. In fact, you will see this ritual where Africans gather, they march singing, banging drums, chanting with music, because they're celebrating not only the fact that this was a loss of a loved one, but the loved one is rejoining his ancestors, which should be a sense of celebration. These same celebrations come from the Akan people of West Africa. And today you see derivatives of this in New Orleans, in Bahamas, in Barbados, in Brazil. So what's important here is that this ritual is a very important indicator of how Africans maintained, or in some cases reclaimed, their very African identity that exists today across the African diaspora. It's also important to recognize that many of these Africans wanted to return. There were many in Newport who felt very strongly that we are free, and as a free choice, we would return to Africa. Anthony Tony Taylor is one of the early presidents of the African Union Society. And as early as 1787, in 1788 and 89, he's sending letters to fellow Africans all across New England and into Philadelphia suggesting, join me in returning to Africa. It's a fascinating discussion because these are Africans looking to return to Africa well before the establishment of the American Colonization Society, which was really white people institutions sending away free blacks or free African people so that they would not disrupt the existing slave system. In Tony Taylor's case, he wanted to return to Africa because he felt the need to return to his homeland. He dies and obviously is buried in Newport, and a group of Africans would not return until 1826. And one of the great ironies is several dozen African families leave Newport in 1826. They land in Liberia, and nearly all of them die of disease within the year of landing, but they died free men and women and children in a free land under a free choice. And the markers that we have, as I said earlier, represent Africans who are tradespeople. We have hundreds of documents and stories of African men and women and children who are tradespeople in colonial New England and Rhode Island and Newport. This marker here is a marker of Phyllis, the wife of Pero Bannister. Pero Bannister is enslaved and later a free African, a part of the John Bannister House. John Bannister is one of the most prominent merchants. Today, he's recognized. His colonial home still stands on Pelham Street in Spring Street. And his wharf, Bannister's Wharf, that bears his name, is probably one of Newport's most popular destinations. If you've come to Newport and you're looking for clam chowder or dining or to see the harbor, you've been on Bannister's Wharf. But what very few people realize is that Pero Bannister operated one of the most successful and one of the most active oyster houses, restaurants on Bannister's Wharf in the colonial period. In fact, we find many African men operating oyster houses in New York, Connecticut, Providence, Boston, and Newport. And what's important here is that by recognizing these early African entrepreneurs, as we recognize and enjoy hospitality and dining today in places like the Boston waterfront or Providence or Newport or New Haven or Bridgeport, we also have to recognize is that well before these hospitality institutions, there were African men, women, and children also working and also operating as entrepreneurs in these locations. And possibly one of the most interesting, and certainly my wife reminds me, what we think is the most fascinating person that's part of God's Little Acre is a Duchess Comino. She, like many of the Africans, would arrive from the Gold Coast. She arrived young at the age of 13. She's enslaved in the household of William Channing, who's an attorney general, and more importantly, one of the prominent families. She's trained not only as a cook, but particularly trained in the areas of pastry cooking. She is so adept at her training and connections, having a master that is an attorney general. She's entertaining large parties. She finds herself in a circumstance where she's providing what we call today catering, large cooking for large events within Colonial Newport, Colonial Rhode Island. And at one point in her career, she's recognized as officially the pastry queen of Rhode Island. Duchess Comino, husband John, also from specifically Ananabo in today's Ghana, would sign on, and before the American Revolution, joined by another free African, would actually become the first of 2 Africans to attend college in America, the College of New Jersey, which is today recognized as Princeton University. Their studies is disrupted because of the war. John Comino signs on as a privateer so he can raise money to purchase the freedom of his wife and children, and he's killed during the American Revolution. So it would be left to Duchess Comino years later to take some of the money that she earned and eventually purchase the freedom of herself and her daughters. She is today buried in God's Little Acre along with her daughters, Violet and Cynthia. But what's most important, at the time when she was enslaved, she raised a young boy in the William Channing household named William Ellery Channing. William Ellery Channing would grow up to become one of the earliest founders of the Unitarian Church, one of the first great abolitionists in Boston. And he would state in his memoirs that his belief in the universal equality of all men and all women, regardless of race, his Unitarian belief, his universal belief, came from being cared for and interacting with who he believed was one of the most pious and most exemplary persons that he'd ever met, Duchess Comino. He provided the inscription for her burial marker. So even though she arrived in the worst circumstances, an enslaved young girl, she would rise up and become an entrepreneur, a mother, a wife, and most importantly, someone who would begin to influence some of the leading religious and civic leaders of early America. And I just want to emphasize this because they're more than chattel property. They are significant contributors to everything that we cherish today in historic restoration, preservation, and interpretation. And another marker that's important to us because of the imagery, way it looks, is another servant of Josias Linden, a Phyllis, wife of Zingo Stevens. At the time of her death, she dies giving birth to a son. That son dies literally a month later. They're buried together. And if you look very carefully at the marker, you'll see that the child in the arms of the woman has clearly African features. And the woman is wearing a very traditional African head wrap. So what's important here is that even though Africans are enslaved, Africans have some input on their markers and on how they should be seen in life and certainly after death. And later, as the African Union Society is established in free Africans, they have a full hand in buying the markers, overseeing the carving of the markers. But what's most important here is that these markers in God's Little Acre is not only a window to the death of these individuals, but it becomes a window to their very lives. And one of the most interesting aspects of the markers is that many of the Africans in early New England were associated with the maritime trades. In fact, there's some great written work by scholars, Black Japs by Jeff Lee Boster and Jay Coutry's Notorious Triangle, where they talk about significant percentages of all colonial and early 19th century vessels in New England had African indigenous heritage crew. In Newport's case, it's over 20% of the crew of African people. We have a number of Africans that are buried in God's Little Acre, and in their burials and even in their markers, it's inscribed, they died at sea, they were mariners. So it's important to recognize that these markers give us a clear window into not only the death of these individuals, but their trade. And one of the most important aspects of the African mariners is that the sea in the 18th and 19th century was kind of the internet of the time. The way you transported not only goods and products, but information came through the sea. And as these African mariners were trading and traveling from seaport to seaport, they would come back and say, I was just in Philadelphia, and they have a large free African community there. They have an African Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, and they have a Baptist church. If you're ever looking to go somewhere else, you have to think of Philadelphia. Or if they're in Baltimore, they're talking about traveling to Newport, Rhode Island, because they have a free African community there. So having Africans involved in the maritime trades, it gave them the mobility and access to the sea as the internet to exchange information back and forth between free African communities in the 18th and 19th century and help them in their ability to live and prosper in early American history. And again, God's Little Acre has a number of markers that help us tell this story and interpret this story further. And I just want to close and point out the restoration work, because we wouldn't be here, I wouldn't have this privilege to present this if it wasn't for the men and women that have been working tirelessly to restore these markers. Through grants through the National Trust for Historic Preservation, private contributions, we've been able to engage a number of restoration artists who have worked by hand to restore these markers. Beyond, this is my awful recognition and my one commercial, but I have to say it, beyond the gravestones in Connecticut, they are outstanding. And they by hand have been working with us in restoring slate markers, granite markers, marble markers, and I can't tell you how appreciative we are of the work that they're doing. It is tedious work, it is challenging work, and most importantly, it is absolutely necessary work. And we've been very fortunate to be able to work with professionals such as Beyond the Gravestones and others who are doing this very important work to give me the privilege to be able to interpret and present to audiences like yourselves. And I want to stop here because, as I said before, these stories in stone are my own family. My own ancestors are buried there. I'm a part of this. If you see the center image, that's me in 1966 and 7 years old, my sailor hat, and I'm visiting my uncle on Memorial Day, which we do every Memorial Day to visit his marker and other ancestors. So for me, this is a part of my family history. This gives me a sense that people of African heritage who look like me and look like my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were also part of the early important history of Newport, Rhode Island, and America. So I'm going to end here with a short 2-minute musical interlude. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to the markers of the children. We have many children who are buried at God's Little Acre. In many cases, they died at very early age because of disease. In other cases, they were just beloved daughters, sons, or grandchildren that wanted to receive a proper marker. When you see these markers, I wanted to really bring to you the importance that these are not chattel property. They are beloved human beings. So I will connect a marker and what's written on the marker with an actual African child today who would have originated with the Yoruba people, the Fanti, Ashanti, Akan people. And I hope it gives you a sense of the importance of historic interpretation that connects the history with the people.
You're broken down and tired of living life on the merry-go-round. You can't find a fighter, but I see it in you, so we gon' walk it out. Move mountains, we gon' walk it out and move mountains. And I'll rise like the day. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. And I'll rise up, I like the waves. I'll rise up, in spite of the ache. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. The silence isn't quiet, and it feels like it's getting hard to breathe. And I know you feel like dying, but I promise we'll take the world to its feet. Move mountains, bring it to its feet. Move mountains. And I'll rise up, I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up, I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up, and I do it 1,000 times again. You but that we have each other. And we will rise, we will rise, we will rise. Oh, we'll rise. I'll rise up, rise like the day. I'll rise up in spite of the ache. I will rise 1,000 times again, and we'll rise up. I like the waves. We'll rise up in spite of the ache. We'll rise up, and we'll do it 1,000 times again. Thank you for taking me out.
And thank you for being so patient. Close to 400 years of history in about 45 minutes. And I welcome to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was extremely touching at the end. I know, anytime I visit a historic cemetery, it's always the children's stones that are really the most touching, and it's really important to see them and know a little bit more about their stories as well. So we have some great questions already. One is from our site manager here at Historic New England for Casey Farm down in Rhode Island. And she asks, like a painting or a fine piece of furniture, can the hand of the artist be detected on a gravestone? At Casey Farm, they have 3 John Stevens signed stones. And they would like to know if Pompey Stevens' work could maybe be attributed to some of the stones that they have in their small burial plot there.
That's a great question. We have 3 generations of John Stevens, the first, second, and third, that are associated with Colonial Newport and other places, but certainly in the common burying ground. And they're carving many of the markers of enslaved and free Africans. There is a Pompey Stevens who is an enslaved African who's a stone polisher and potentially a carver in the John Stevens shop. He signs 2 existing stones, including the Pompey Linden stone, which is signed at the end, PS. And then there's a second stone that is signed, which he states is his brother, Quash. We believe that Pompey Stevens might have, once he became free, reverted back to his African name, Zingo Stevens, because Pompey Stevens ceased to exist, or we can't find him in primary records, and Zingo Stevens is quite prominent. And we do find numerous cases of Africans, once they become free, they're members of the African Society, they drop either all or part of their enslaved names and take on an African name. So as an example, you have a Saba Nubia who was enslaved as Jack Mason, but when he's free, he becomes Saba Nubia. We have Nukaba Mariku, who's Newport Gardner, and when he's free, he goes back and forth with Newport Gardner, Newport Mariku, Rokaba Mariku. So we believe that there's certainly Pompey Zingo Stevens might be the same person, or there might be one of 2 who were stone polishers and carvers, and there are at least 3 signed markers that still exist in God's Little Acre section of common burying ground.
So that relates to another question. If you wanted to maybe flesh that out a little bit more, someone wants to know if the gravestone carvings that we were shown were done by African craftsmen, or were they done by the white craftsmen who were also working at that time?
Most of the early markers at the time of slavery and markers of an enslaved person were ordered by the master and mistress of the house. What's important is that at the time of the colonial era, you very rarely had a marker. I mean, you had to have status, you had to have some access to monetary, And the fact that enslaved had access to and were given markers is important in its own right. What's also important is what's written on the markers. Here in New England, we're a bit genteel. Very rarely do you see the term slave, it's servant. But let me be clear, they're enslaved. You also see where, again, as Africans were worshiping and working in close proximity, for the most part, they're living in the same household. African children are arriving and living in the same household. And as they get older, they're living in either what we call the pantry or the garret or the attic that's sometimes called. But they're living in close proximity. So this living, working, and worshiping, not in an integration, but in an independent fashion, it creates some level of humanity. So you certainly see markers where it states beloved servant, or loving servant, or member and worshiping in the Baptist faith. We have a cluster of Africans, enslaved and free, that are clustered together and all part of Jewish households in Newport, and some take on Jewish names. We have one record of 5 Africans listed as Israelites. So
interesting.
It's important to recognize that these markers to interpretation, and by matching it with primary and secondary documentation, it creates this unique circumstance where you have Africans, enslaved and free, living, working, and worshiping in this highly compact, densely compacted urban environment where they are interdependent. I want to be clear here. It's not integration. They are interdependent. And that's where you see it translated in some level of humanity in the recognition of their markers, the recognition of a purchase of a marker. And then later, the Free African Society and Free Africans would purchase their own markers. They would hire a John Stevens the first, second, or third to etch a stone for their family member or for their member. And we have the records that point that out.
So also kind of related to that, several people were asking about the origin of the first name Pompey and why it was so popular among this community, or among the people who are naming members of this community.
The well-read, genteel, colonial merchant class at that time would love to present the fact that their property would represent their education and their well-bred nature. So it was a very standard practice to give enslaved African men and women names from Greek mythology. You see Romanesque names. Prince is a very popular name. Cato, Cicero is very popular. Queen, Duchess are very. In fact, one of the interesting anomalies is Phyllis is a very popular name for African women across New England. In Newport, at the very least, we have a number of Violets. We could not find a white woman with the name Violet in the colonial records. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but what records we reviewed, we did not find Violet, but we found Violet almost consistently. There are dozens and dozens of Violets in African women in colonial Newport. So you have one part of it is that pride of ownership. I'm naming my favorite enslaved African boy Cato or Caesar. On the other hand, you do have Africans that maintain or reclaim their African names. And when they become converted into the religion of their household, you see a blending. So we have a boy, Solomon Nuba Tike. So it's a part of the tradition of the time. It's a part of the recognition of the master and missus standing in the community. And in some cases, it's Africans reclaiming their own identity.
Someone has a question about Duchess. And how did she get her freedom from the Attorney General's household, or did she?
Duchess, like many Africans, because of the settlement of New England, but particularly Newport under the tenets of religious freedom, Sundays was seen as a day off, including the enslaved. But enslaved were allowed to, with their trade skills, to ply their own trade and work. The fact that you had these highly specialized trade skills, these African men and women were of a high demand. So if you were in Boston and had a boat building project and you knew you had some really good shipwrights in Newport, you would lease them out from Newport to spend time in Boston doing that work. Or if you had a soap making going on in New London, you had some really skilled soap makers of Castilian soap in Newport, you leased them out. But if they were working on Sundays, they had the opportunity to earn their own money. And it was an incentive for them to be loyal, to be of the highest productivity. We have a number of cases where Africans are purchasing their own freedom, or we have cases where Africans are actually using their proceeds and participating in lotteries. Lotteries are not a modern day creation. There are lotteries that go back to ancient times. And in Rhode Island and across New England, lotteries were used to raise money for public infrastructure, town wharfs, town commons. And we have several cases where Africans pooled their resources and won lotteries and would purchase their freedom. In other cases, they're emancipated by wills. In other cases, they're running away. But most importantly, in the case of Duchess, she purchases her own freedom through her own savings. Her husband had died, and she would purchase her own freedom and the freedom of her children.
Someone would like to know about the African institutions, the African Governance Council, for example, and what happened to these institutions in Newport and New England generally.
They evolved. As I said earlier, the early African Union societies would evolve into African churches and African meeting houses. And then these African meeting houses would evolve into freestanding Black churches. You also see early African schools with the fight in Boston and Providence and Newport for integrating schools by the mid part of the 19th century. There was no need for private African schools because now African-American children had the right to go to public schools on behalf of their tax-paying parents. So it's an evolution of time. You also have a movement. By the end of the American Revolution, Newport is so disrupted by British occupation that many of the population leave, including the Africans. Many of the free Africans leave Newport, and we see them relocating to Providence and Boston. In fact, Providence, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, is attracting free Africans from Connecticut, Massachusetts, Providence, and Providence by the early 19th century becomes a major center of African-American institutions. So some of it is evolution, some of it is choice. In my own family sense, we have colonial and 19th century records and diaries and prayer books where they're moving between, they're not going south. I don't have family members going to New Orleans in the 1840s, and they're not going to Savannah, but they're going to Philadelphia, to Bridgeport, Connecticut, to Providence, Rhode Island, to Boston, to Medford, and back to Newport and in New York City. And they're moving back and forth based upon opportunities of work, opportunities of worship, and opportunities to just live a free life as an African or an African-American in 18th, 19th century America.
So to wrap it up, could you tell us a little bit about if there are resources for people who want to know more about the African heritage community in Newport and want to visit places, specifically if people want to visit God's Little Acre, do you provide walking tours? Are there specific guidelines people should take to visit respectfully?
That's a great question. It's a public place. It's municipally owned. It's a public place. We have purposely kept the gates open. We do ask that people be respectful that it's a burying ground. It's not a dog park. It's not a recreation area. So please be respectful, but we want people to engage and intersperse and interact with the environment. It can be a challenge, quite candidly, and we work on it each and every day. There are walking tours sponsored by the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society and the Newport Historical Society. Every now and then they'll dust me off if they want me to do a tour. But we do a lot of great training of the historical institutions in Newport who do a wonderful job on tours. We're all waiting for the day when we're safe and we can come again and visit. But in small groups, we encourage people to go out and enjoy the place. We're very proud of it. The materials are of the 18th century of slate, so they're very fragile. Later, we introduced marble and granite, but it's the 18th century markers. Every 18th century marker of slate that you see in God's Little Acre is of an African, enslaved or free.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really enlightening presentation for me, and I'm sure for everyone else who's watched this program. We did record the program, as some of you have asked, and I will be sending out a link to the recording in a follow-up email. And I also will be sending a link to a program we're having tomorrow night about a Boston early civil rights leader, William Monroe Trotter. We're going to be hearing from the biographer of this somewhat forgotten civil rights advocate who did a lot in the Boston community in the early 20th century. So I hope you
And
will
I
join
have
us
some of
for
his
that.
records, Claire, so please reach
Oh,
out to me.
really? Oh, that's so
William
interesting.
Trotter hung out in Providence and Newport, and Newport people hung
Mhm.
out in Boston. So we have lots of records.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I will definitely be in touch. And like I said, I will put the information about that program in the follow-up email, and I hope you can join us for that. And thank you again. This was really fascinating program. And I hope everyone here has a great night, and we see you at another Historic New England program soon.